Welcome to History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, leave us a comment down below, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. And now, on to tonight's episode. July 27, 1816. Along the Apalachicola River in the panhandle of Spanish Florida stands Negro Fort, a structure built just 2 years prior by the British to serve their cause during their failed reclamation of the United States colonies in the War of 1812. Within the confines of the fort stood a diverse contingent of Choctaw natives and fugitive slaves from Spanish and American colonies. They are locked in a defensive struggle to hold the sanctuary from an incursion by American Brigadier General Edmund Pendleton Gaines, his 116 Army soldiers, more than 150 Coweta and Creek allies, and a small command of U.S. gunboats. The fugitive slaves, many of whom fought alongside the British in the War of 1812, held out hope that the island empire would return to their relief. But the British, having been repulsed in the war, would have no further strategic interest in coming back. The colonial fugitives, led by a 30-year-old former slave, a skilled carpenter who fled from Spanish-held Pensacola, going only by the moniker Garçon, had informed the Americans and their native allies that they would accept nor offer any quarter, for they knew the intentions of the Americans to return them back to their quote-unquote legal owners into bondage. After weeks of preparation, skirmishing, and terse deliberations, the Battle of Negro Fort would come to a catastrophic and horrifying end, as several hundred lives of the men, women, and children within the timber walls of the fortification would at once come to a furious and fiery end, stamped out in an instant with a single emphatic explosion of powder and iron that would scarce be seen in this era of human combat. The demographic landscape of the territory now encompassing the current American state of Florida had undergone a series of drastic alterations in the 3 centuries preceding this battle. Beginning in the early 1500s, the Spanish Empire would undertake the first major European land claim within North America. They would establish a small number of forts and settlements at St. Mark's, St. Augustine, and, in the west, Pensacola, but would not establish considerable settlements beyond the trifecta of territorial anchors. The Florida mainland had once been a thriving, interwoven network of native peoples, but, along with the Spanish expeditionary missions, came a host of infectious diseases that devastated these indigenous populations, rendering much of La Florida sparsely populated for years to come. To the north of Florida, in territory that now largely belongs to the states of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, were the still thriving Creek people. The Creeks did not have a traditional hierarchical structure. Instead, they had an interwoven confederacy of clans, tracing their lineage all the way back to a single maternal ancestor. The various clans would, by principle, intermarry with one another, creating an enduring bond and tying them all together in what has been described as, quote, the rope of sand. Yet, the multi-generational tapestry these native clans had long enjoyed would face a civilizational crisis that came not from the European settlers' diseases, but rather their way of life. In the 1700s, what could broadly be described as, quote, high-status Creeks began to trade for and utilize African slaves to the benefit of the Creeks' agrarian way of life. They would farm cotton on their own plantations, and some Creeks would amass significant wealth in comparison to their centuries-long history that came before these cross-Atlantic influences began to reshape their society. While the, quote, rope of sand had connected the clans together and given them a shared interest of which to defend against attacks by settlers and rival tribes alike, it was without a truly authoritative figure atop the tribal structure. With no way to rule for or against this use of human chattel, a schism occurred within the various clans, and several Creeks would relocate to South Florida. Due to the depopulationary events of the prior Spanish plagues that ravaged the local native peoples, land for these withdrawing Creeks was readily abundant. The Spanish would refer to the newly arrived natives as Seminole, meaning runaways or wild ones. This would, over time, evolve into the name they are known by to this day, Seminole. They would establish communities that implemented European-style farms and ranching, and, informed in part by their divergence from the Creeks, they would grow in size as a haven for escaped black slaves, whether they were, quote, owned by American, Spanish, or even Creek entities. These, quote, black Seminoles would adopt the way of life of the welcoming natives, who required they maintain their own settlements, offer up tributes of crops annually, and fight alongside the Seminoles against their American adversaries. The disputes between the United States and the, quote, Red Sticks and Creeks, of whom the Seminoles were born from, dated far back into the past, with many attacks, skirmishes, and uprisings occurring in what in hindsight appears to be a never-ending conflict. Most recently, the Red Stick War was fought over the course of a year, spanning from the summer of 1813 to the summer of 1814. It was both a territorial dispute between the empires of the United States, Spain, and Great Britain, but also was effectively a civil war among the Creeks. The war would be ended with the signing of the Treaty of Fort Jackson, resulting in Andrew Jackson securing the surrender of 21 million acres of land in southern Georgia and central Alabama, at the cost of 2,000 casualties, the majority of which belonged to the alliance opposing the United States. With factions within factions fighting one another, and the presence of European nation-states forming alliances with and against themselves and various tribes as the ever-evolving situation saw fit, it is fair to say that the layers of nuance held within each particular conflict that occurred over the territory of North America can at times carry upon itself a dense veneer of murky indistinguishability. What the Red Stick War undeniably managed to do, however, was bring the Seminole Nation into the direct focus of General Andrew Jackson and the United States government. For context, General Jackson had famously demolished the British invasion of New Orleans just 18 months prior to the grisly events that would occur at Negro Fort, and the Seminole proclivity for both assisting the British as well as harboring fugitive slaves had been a significant point of contention for Old Hickory. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 authorized the government to seize and return escapees to their owners and incur penalties against those who aided in their fight. This would serve as a pretext for the actions the United States would authorize in their expedition into the Spanish-held territory. The fort that held several hundred escaped slaves who had worked with the British in the War of 1812, having been built by the Brits in 1815, stood in present-day Franklin County in the Florida Panhandle. If Jackson wanted to mobilize a force to attack the fort, he would need the authorization given to him by the current Commander-in-Chief, James Madison. Madison had previously authorized force to support rebellions against Spain by residents of West Florida. While he had first exercised patience and restraint in the matter, by March of 1816, he ordered Jackson to inform the governor of West Florida, Mauricio de Zuniga, that the laws of nations required them to come together to, quote, put an end to an evil of so serious a nature. Ultimately, the decision would fall to Madison on whether force would be used to take the fort and if it needed congressional approval. Andrew Jackson did not wait, and instead would set forth the military operation that would result in the assault on Negro Fort. Jackson wrote to General Gaines telling him, quote, you possess the power of acting on your own discretion, which I hope you will exercise on this. West Florida Governor Mauricio de Zuniga would respond to Jackson's earlier correspondence regarding the Negro Fort that, quote, the Spanish government needed to destroy or remove from our frontier this banditti, put an end to an evil of so serious a nature, and return to our citizens and the friendly Indians inhabiting our territory those Negroes now in the said fort and which have been stolen and enticed from them. This response further emboldened Jackson to take actions to address Negro Fort. The operation began the last week of June 1816 with U.S. gunboats and schooners headed for Apalachicola Bay. Arriving on July 10th, they carried with them guns, provisions, and supplies. The gunboats weighed upward of 25 tons. They each carried 50 sailors with several large cannons stretching over 60 feet in length. The destruction per capita offered by these vessels was practically unrivaled. The naval vessels would meet up with Allied Creek Chief Lafarca at the mouth of the Apalachicola. Colonel Clinch had ordered them to hold their position, and he then began his movement south from Camp Crawford with 116 men on July 17th in well-armed and reinforced flatboats. Clinch would link up with Chief William McIntosh and his 150 Coweta warriors. He then added another detachment of Creeks the following day, under the command of Mad Tiger. The arrangement between Clinch and the native chiefs in regards to compensation was $50 for every captured slave. The natives were also given the right of first refusal when it came to looting the fort after its capture. The first shot of the Battle of Negro Fort was fired on July 15th, as the advance of gunboats and schooners of the Americans saw a group of men pulling a small vessel out of the water ahead of them. One American boat went forth to approach the party and was fired upon with a volley of musket balls that struck into the boat. 2 days after this, Sailing Master Loomis sent a small boat with 4 sailors up the river in search of fresh water. They spied a black man standing alone on the riverbank, then docked their vessel and went ashore to speak with the man. And just as they had done so, no fewer than 40 black and native men appeared brandishing muskets. With them was their commander, Garçon. They opened fire and took the lives of 3 of the sailors at once. Another sailor, John Lopez, was wounded but managed to escape via swimming the waters of the river. The worst fate would, however, fall upon the man they captured, Edward Daniels, who was taken to the fort, heavily tarred, and then burned alive. Over the coming days, varying reports of success had been documented regarding the ability of the American native forces to capture fleeing slaves, one of whom held the scalp of Edward Daniels in his hand when he was overtaken by McIntosh's Coweta warriors. He was on his way to show off his trophy to the Seminoles as proof of their actions and the hostilities that were now underway. The next several days were, in relative terms, fairly uneventful. The defenders of Fort Negro used the artillery and weaponry within the structure to keep the encroaching men at a distance. Shot, shell, grape, and rockets would serve as a capable deterrent, but would do little to inflict significant damage upon the American native allies, who were content to let the fortification burn through their munitions as they took cover. The black defenders of the fort at one point launched an offensive raid against the Coweta warriors. The engagement was conducted in such close quarters that muskets were of little effect, with the bulk of the ferocious fighting being undertaken with tomahawks and knives. These clashes persisted for the better part of 3 days, before the Coweta gained a clear advantage and the black, quote, Maroons, as they had often been called, made their return within the fort. The American Dr. Buck would recount after observing this gruesome, days-long clash of hand-to-hand fighting, quote, even though they were Indians, Negroes, and our enemies, it was clear that they were determined to fight to the end, and never to be taken alive. McIntosh would then destroy all of the fruit, corn, and livestock surrounding the fort, and a small collection of native leaders approached the fort to demand it be surrendered. The party was met with considerable disdain, and the leader, Garçon, informed them that he had been left in command by the authority of the British government, and his orders were to sink any American vessels who attempted to pass beyond them. Though it had been over a year since the British had abandoned the fort and the War of 1812 ended, they still held out hope that they would be reinforced and relieved by the British in time. Surrendering was of little incentive, as they were aware of the objective of the American native forces to return them to their, quote, legal slaveholders. On the 26th of July, Clinch's army and Loomis's navy would finally be joined together several miles below Prospect Bluff. Then, a detachment of soldiers was sent to the rear of the fort to join the Cowetas under McIntosh. The following morning, on the 27th, the gunboats would be positioned along the river within cannon shot of the fort. This brought a cannonade upon the American native positions from the guns within the fort, but it did little damage. The position of his gunboats, however, was described by Loomis as, quote, point-blank range. For the next hour, the sides exchanged voluminous cannon fire, with neither gaining a clear advantage. It wasn't until the American sailing master upon gunboat 154 began to heat the shells with a makeshift furnace that the battle would be abruptly decided. The red-hot cannonball was launched from the vessel, cutting through the dewy, dense air of the Florida summer morning with devilish intent. It passed high above the fort's outer perimeter and crashed directly into the gunpowder magazine arsenal. Instantly, a deafening eruption that was said to be heard as far as 100 miles away ignited in an enormous fireball that could be seen high above the walls of the fortification, at once immolating, concussing, and launching into the air hundreds of men, women, and children that inhabited the structure. Dr. Buck would somberly recount this dreadful exhibition. Quote, "You cannot conceive, nor I describe, the horrors of the scene. In an instant, hundreds of lifeless bodies were stretched upon the plain, buried in sand and rubbish, or suspended from the tops of the surrounding pines. The soldiers, while relieved with the almost instantaneous resolution to the battle, were taken aback by the utter devastation they had just laid bare." Buck continued, "They checked their celebrations to drop a tear on the distressing scene." Accounts of the casualties vary amongst primary sources, but the consensus lies that roughly 300 individuals described as fugitive slaves and at least 25 of their Choctaw allies were present within the fort during the explosion, with roughly only 25 of them in total surviving the battle's concise and fiery conclusion. McIntosh's Cowitas began butchering all of the black survivors of the explosion quite literally before the dust had even settled. Colonel Clinch would hurry into the ruins of the fort and pled for the massacre to cease. Some feel he did this because it appealed to his sense of humanity. Others state that he merely wanted them alive because they were rightfully the property of slave owners, and it was his mission to return them. Improbable as it was, Garçon and a nameless Choctaw had survived the blast. Immediately upon their apprehension, they were tried for the murder of the 4 sailors at the outset of the battle. In their final act of defiance, they took responsibility for the killings and were promptly scalped and shot. Seminole leader Neamathla was angered by the destruction of the fort that caused the death of the members of his people. He would send a warning to General Gaines that should his forces cross the Flint River, they would come under attack by the Seminoles. General Gaines would respond by sending a detachment to arrest Neamathla, which would erupt in a barbarous confrontation. After the Battle of Negro Fort, all of the pieces were finally in place for the First Seminole War, and what would follow would invoke a series of utterly jarring acts of violence. But the tales of depredation and destruction in the First Seminole War are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the Join button below, or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.